What's the risk? So whenever we're giving a medicine, we have to know the risk versus the benefit. What is the reason we anticoagulate AFib? There's a risk of stroke. Okay? Now, what's the risk of the anticoagulation? Bleeding. Okay? So now, the reason that we would give anticoagulation is if the risk of stroke is higher than the risk of bleeding. Okay? How do we know that? Chad's VAS score, right? Now, the Chad's VAS score is based on what? What's the data? What's the research that creates the Chad's VAS score?
I'm not sure what exactly the trial data was.
So the data is outpatients over months and months and months. Okay? Right? So the Chad's VAS studies show that if you have a higher Chad's VAS score over a year, right? The highest Chad's VAS score has a risk of stroke of like 11-something% a year. And that risk is higher than over a year, the risk of bleeding. Okay? Now, in the hospital, is the risk of bleeding higher or lower than as an outpatient?
Higher.
Definitely higher. Like, ask anybody who's worked in the ICU for a long time, ask them, how many times have you seen somebody in the hospital who's had a stroke from AFib, an embolic stroke? Maybe I've seen it once. Okay, and then ask them, how many times have you seen somebody have a catastrophic or fatal bleed on heparin? Everybody will raise their hand. Multiple times. Okay? So, to extrapolate outpatient data to the inpatient setting is dangerous. It could very well be that the risk of bleeding is higher in the hospital, in which case the benefits of heparin are outweighed by the risks. Also, because the risk of stroke is over a year, then you really have to extrapolate the risk of stroke, you have to you have to divide by 365. So the stroke risk on a day-to-day basis, and we're talking about days here, not years, is low. The bleeding risk is higher. So if we have a significant possibility that the risks outweigh the benefits, and for sure we don't know, so for the principle of first do no harm, we shouldn't be giving heparin, and for sure not DOACs. Please. I saw somebody die on a DOAC for AFib, I think 2 months ago. Okay?
Because of bleeding?
From bleeding, intracranial hemorrhage. Okay? And it was for AFib. Right? Okay? So if you look it up, I've looked it up, there's not a lot of data for inpatients, and the risk of stroke is much lower than the risk of bleeding. Okay? You understand?
But